Welcome to Share the Mic. This is a time of conversation between diverse neighbors in the South, where we encourage empathy and take one more step towards eliminating racism. My guests today are Rebecca and Clint Denson, an interracial couple who are involved in the Common Thread community here in Birmingham. Common Thread is a network of people that see their homes, businesses, and the community as the church, with all being opportunities to share the love of Jesus and steward people for a better and more equitable world. Rebecca is a graduate of the Beeson Divinity School of Samford University here in Birmingham, where they met. Rebecca is also the founder of Sachai Tea Company, and Clint is the head teacher at Awake, a community in-town school also in Titusville. Both of these organizations were founded as Common Thread initiatives. Rebecca and Clint have 3 beautiful children and live in the Titusville community of Birmingham, Alabama. Welcome, Rebecca and Clint. Glad you're here.
Yeah, thank you. We're glad to be here.
Thank you, Libby. We're glad to be here.
Rebecca, let's start with you and your background. Can you give us a brief introduction to your family life in India, especially as it relates to classism and caste?
Yeah. So I grew up in India in a city called Bangalore. And Bangalore is a smaller city in India. Most people hear of Mumbai or Delhi or Calcutta. But Bangalore is a large city. And
like what size?
It's, to put it in perspective, compared to New York, it's about 1.5 the size of New York in population.
Wow. So that's like 12 million people?
Millions of people. And you can't ever go down a street and not see several hundreds of people.
Everywhere.
So I grew up in Bangalore, and Bangalore is kind of like a, growing city, and so it's a melting pot of different cultures and languages. And so in India, there are so many subcultures and languages and even races. There's the Aryan race and the Dravidian race.
What about where your father grew up?
Yeah, so my father, he originally grew up in a small village in India, and he was actually from a lower caste community. So caste system is very prevalent in India. Nobody really knows where it started and how it started, but it's a classification of people by birth. So you're born into a caste. You're born into a lower caste, or which are all the serving castes, and then there are the higher castes that are the more privileged caste. So they had historically, they're the only ones that had the right to education and to owning property. In Bangalore, we didn't see a lot of the caste system because by education and having jobs in the city, you kind of bypass it. But in the villages, it's very prevalent, and you can see it on Google Earth. If you zoom in to any village in India, you have the lower caste community. You'll see 2 pockets. You'll see the lower caste houses and then the higher caste houses, and it's separated so their lives don't integrate.
They don't even share the same water, so
they wouldn't touch the same things.
Essentially 2 villages.
Yeah. But it's one village. It has the same name.
Mm-hmm.
So he grew up in a village like that, and I remember my grandfather, trying to break that structure or that social norm of this hierarchy in the caste system. And he, I remember I have this memory of being in my grandfather's village when I was 8 or something, and there was this practice where if a higher caste person came into your house, then everybody have to stand up. Stop what you're doing and just stand up. Even if you're not in the conversation, it's just to show respect. So my grandmother would still do that, and my grandfather would look over and say, Cucho, like he'll say, there's no need to stand up, like sit down, like.
That's what cucho means?
Cucho means sit down, yeah. And so he taught his children to like not conform to that and to be progressive minded and to break out of that norm, because he just believed that, we're all humans and we all have the same value.
And then your father was educated. So tell us about that.
Yeah. So my father's family was really poor, which is typical of any lower caste family, because till like the mid 20th century, lower caste people did not have the right to education or the right to own property. So they had very little property and to farm on. And my grandparents sold like their last silver ornament so that my dad could go to high school. And
that was a really big deal to do that.
Yeah, that was a big deal, because typically back in the day they would have said, all right, you're strong enough, let's get you in the field and working in the field.
Tell us how you see classism and caste in the States, especially any direct experiences you've had with America's caste system.
For somebody like me, growing up in Asia, watching movies like Jurassic Park or Home Alone, you tend to think that America's full of white people and affluent people too. So it was really interesting when I moved here, that I had this realization that there are other people here. There are African Americans, and there are Hispanics, and there are natives, and all of them have a history here. And so that was really interesting. And
a surprise.
It was surprising in a good way, because, I loved that there was diversity here. And so I had to like learn the history in a deeper way and embrace it in a deeper way.
Did you notice, though, differences in class, or, did you see an obvious casting? I don't know if that's a word, but we'll call it one.
Yeah. When I first moved here, I noticed how there was White Town and there was Black Town. And White Town looked prettier. The landscape was more beautiful. It was more organized and planned. And it was the symbol of affluence. And then there was Black Town, and it was not as well planned. The landscape didn't look as pretty. And, like it was the symbol of under-resourced and marginalized. And so
did you draw differences or similarities to India, to your grandfather's village?
Yeah, I would totally say that's what it symbolized. And it was shocking to me, because I would have imagined America to be more progressive and not have these differences, and that people were more unified and that people were more mixed.
Right. So, Clint, let's go to you. Tell us about marrying a foreigner, an Indian woman of color. How did your family embrace or not embrace Rebecca?
Yeah, when I told my mom, who is the mayor of the town that I'm from, small town Mississippi, so she's like hometown girl, that I'm going to marry or want to marry Rebecca, being from India. And her first reaction is not necessarily the different race factor, but she's not like she's going to take you away even further than
from Mississippi.
But yeah, she's going to take you to India and take my grandchildren with them whenever they come. So
her fear was you moving away.
And it's being foreign, so there's that factor of not only is it just, in California or somewhere that still seems relatively accessible, but there's a foreign sense of, she may have a lot of comfort here in America and like being able to actually travel and move about, but you go to India as an American, no language. I mean, you don't. It's just so much different. And so knowing that those struggles are going to come with connecting with family, her family. And so as far as like extended family and, again, being small town Mississippi, just kind of always like sitting back at Thanksgiving dinners and being like, what is going to be said that I'm going to have to cringe over or apologize for. So that's still happening. But there's definitely a people who class people based on their skin color and based on their background. And so it's like, okay, and that's interesting when people do that, because they can take an individual, they can say, oh, no, they're not like that, but these people are like
people
that.
Are.
And knowing that that's the mindset of a lot of my family, and knowing, okay, you may see Becky or Rebecca as this individual, but I know that I've heard what you said about people from India, or, the very few people that they actually interact with.
So, Rebecca, can you give the answer as well? How about your family? Did they accept Clint, a white American from Alabama?
In case my mom listens to this, you said a white American from Alabama. I got to clarify, I'm from Mississippi, so double down on
sorry.
that. I mean, like the Mississippi is, I think, what's Alabama's slogan? Like, at least we're not Mississippi.
Yeah, right. But you were from Alabama when you met her, right?
Yes, I just don't want my mom to hear that.
Yeah. I can speak for my immediate family. They were really open to Clint, and because their worldview was not limited like most other people.
They're a progressive family, really.
Yeah, I would, like, my extended relatives maybe might not have such an open worldview, but they embraced Clint's story and just how he had traveled overseas and lived overseas for a few years, and how he had respect for international people and international culture, and even just his personality and how he was just humble and very respectful. So,
did y'all have the big Indian wedding? And
we tried to. We had it in Mississippi, and
really?
We had Indian elements and Western elements in the wedding. But for other people, I would say, like, they were probably thinking, man, you cashed in. You cashed into the, white American husband. You cashed into, like, the American dream, or, the ultimate immigrant dream. Like, you cashed in. So that's a judgment that I sense a lot. No one has said it, but it does create a divide in not seeing Clint for who he is.
Yeah.
So do you think you're treated differently when you're with Rebecca as a couple?
Yeah, I mean, as a couple, for sure. We were talking about it as we were kind of considering our some things that set apart that we assume set us apart. Like, whenever we go out to eat, we've never once not been asked, "Is this check? Are y'all together or separate?"
Huh.
So I don't know if, like, when you go out on a date with your husband, if they ever.
No.
I mean, they ask you?
No.
Okay, we've been asked every time.
That's really crazy.
That is crazy.
So every time we go, this is not with our kids. It's a special date night. Both of us are dressed up. But there's never this assumption that maybe they could be dating and maybe they're on the same check. There's always an assumption that we're on separate checks. And it's every time. There's not been one time, which is very, surprising to me.
And do you feel like you're treated differently when you're with or without Clint as well?
Yeah, I would say I definitely go in and out of being white and privilege, and not being white, being an outsider and not having privilege. I think that, like Clint was saying, people have more patience to hear when Clint is around. They want to hear more, or they are more trusting, or they have the time. But when Clint is not around, they have assumptions and they don't have the time. Yeah.
So let's talk about your experience living in Titusville. So describe your lives living and raising your children of mixed race in a mostly Black, lower income community.
Yeah, Titusville itself, for us, is an honor to live there. So taking that in, and what I mean by that is the fact that, I'm a white male, not even from Birmingham, but to come from outside and move into such a neighborhood with rich history, rich Black African American history, and to be a part of it, not to come in and say, hey, I'm going to better this neighborhood. I hope that I better that. I hope that my life benefits, my presence benefits the neighborhood. But to not say what are the things that are wrong. So just to be there, is an honor for one. You got to take into what Titusville is. The history of it being a free Black town where right after emancipation, African Americans were starting their own businesses, it flourishing as a Black-run part of Birmingham. The Black Barons practicing baseball at Memorial Park, Condoleezza Rice being from there, Wallace Rayfield, who was the second licensed architect, Black architect in America, and he designed 16th Street Baptist Church along with several other historic African American churches across Alabama and the South. But him living in Titusville, Dr. King's memorial of letter from a Birmingham jail being there, that not being a great thing that happened, him being in
but it is
jail
history.
there, but the history that is there is, so it's an honor to be there and to have our children pass these sites or to tell them these stories or for them to interact with elderly who have lived this. So we have several relationships with people that they get to see every day, and that's really beautiful. But there's also a lot of brokenness there too, which is a difficult dynamic of wanting our children to see the beauty of this neighborhood, but knowing that they're going to see the brokenness of it too. And will their perspective be, man, this Black neighborhood that I grew up in was so broken? Or would their perspective be, this Black neighborhood that I grew up in was such an honor? And
so why did you go there? Was it for the brokenness?
We had some leaders in our life who are still in our life that have a church. They're Living Church Ministries. Bishop Demetrius Roscoe and his wife. They were a big influence on us moving there, as far as just kind of spiritual father and mother of inviting us into just the kingdom work that was going on there. We started at Memorial Park coaching. We were coaching youth football leagues. We were playing sports there on Sundays, just getting to know people, and was wanting to integrate our lives into this neighborhood, and not necessarily for the brokenness, because there's brokenness all over.
There is.
But for the hope that we could be part of Jesus' work in this neighborhood that we could feel so strongly happening, and him calling us to put a hand in.
That's beautiful.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I would say when you move into a neighborhood that has issues pest control or animal control and trash and other problems, which every neighborhood has problems, then the problems become your problems. And I think the greatest problem in Titusville or neighborhoods like Titusville is the neglect. And I think that's what I learned early on, when we moved, this is what poverty looks like in America. It's neglect, and neglect of people, neglect of neighborhoods. And it looks different in India, but I learned that was what poverty meant here.
How do we find answers or solutions to these kinds of societal issues?
Obviously, it's relational. Or maybe not obviously. For me, it's relational. You fear what you don't know, and fear grabs for power. Because if you're not powerful over the ones that you fear, then they're gonna become powerful over you. That's the lie. That's the lie from the beginning. And there's no greater motivator besides fear than love. It's love, and maybe love is like up at the ceiling, and then it's like fear. And maybe fear is somewhere, but fear is definitely second. And then it's all the other things, money, but fear can motivate the worst in people. And fear comes from not knowing or being unknown. And for us, and for our children, and for those, we may never see this reconciliation, that we may never see these, this brokenness mended, because we're just trying to take the steps of making relationship and just trying to make the steps of being known and knowing others. And maybe our children won't have to, journey so far, and maybe they will see what it is to love and know one another and not fear somebody based on how they look, where they live, where they're from. And so, yeah, if we can bridge that for ourselves, for our children, for our community, that means a lot.
After living in Titusville for 8 years now, I would say that we're beginning to see that we're just scratching on the surface, and it's going to be a long process. Because this historical trauma and distrust is historical. Like, it exists in our DNA. There's so much research that backs that. And you live a lifetime of distress, and you're taught that, and you're taught biases, and that's how, you continue to live the rest of your life. So I think it's really powerful for people, like Clint was saying, to overcome fear, or to see other people overcome fear.
Yeah.
Like, for people to see an interracial couple in Titusville, like us, is really powerful in itself. Like, we don't have to do anything. We don't have to say anything. We just have to be a normal family and have normal rhythms. And for them to see that we've overcome this fear is huge. It's eye-opening for them. And I think that's what we do for our children, too. Like, we help them overcome their fears by the choices we make and the things that we overcome. So what we set up for them becomes their normal. And yeah, I would say, I definitely feel like the racial tension that exists and the strong biases that exist in this country. And I think that bias is a human thing across the board. I think that it exists in India through caste system, and here through race and classism. Yeah, I think that there's this Western idea of wanting to see change, like immediate change or in the near future. And like what Clint was saying, if you don't see change, or if you don't see like a fruition of your hopes, or your hopes going in a certain direction, then you want to give up. And I want to just encourage that it's going to be a long process. Like, let's not prematurely give up because of our Western mindset to see change, immediate change. And if we look at like great leaders in the past that have led like the civil rights revolution and other revolutions in history, like a lot of their efforts, they didn't even see the results for.
No.
They died just, striving. And so we should definitely remember them and continue to hope and continue to like take those strides. Yeah.
That's nice. So, Rebecca, it's your turn. You get to ask me a hard question.
Yeah. Was there a racial bias that you had to work through growing up, or in the recent past? Is there something that you recall that you want to share?
Well, I'm not sure I want to share it, but I will. So I grew up, I wouldn't say there were many major infractions that I witnessed, more what you might call minor. So, I mean, I never saw some of the things that we're seeing on social media today. But, as I got older, I was a big reader, and I loved books like by Toni Morrison and Alice Walker. Like The Color Purple is one of my favorite all-time books. But those books were really, they didn't move me to action. They were great books. But, again, I read them and then I was done. And so I might go back and read them again. But it really wasn't until last year when George Floyd was killed that my eyes were like wide open. And, it was just so in all of our faces, the video. And so I had to really become a little more self-aware of, am I not doing what I should be doing? When I see infractions, maybe I haven't been doing those things, but when I see someone else do that or I hear something, shouldn't I take action? So I think I've come to terms with that I have to, and I've just become a voracious reader and listener of podcasts on, on anything to do with racism, like the book Caste, fabulous book that I'm in the middle of right now. We've been talking about caste, and there's a great podcast that our friend Ronnie Gatry, our videographer, has out called The Tipping Point. And I'm learning so much in that. It's just I'm learning a new language even, and it's just great exposure to things that I didn't understand. But it's also serious. They're whimsical, the hosts, but it's also serious. And so I think learning so that when I do see infractions, that I do take action. I would say I was uncomfortable with that before, but now I've become comfortable with that discomfort.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I would say for me recently, I've realized curiosity, just simple curiosity of why would this person, act like this, or why is this person saying this, and taking into consideration their historical background and whatever they've been through. And putting yourself, most importantly, in their shoes. And I think that's what helps us overcome biases in general. And I think we put too much stake into our biases and into our judgments, and we let it rule us. Or we put too much stake into whiteness, or we put too much identity into whiteness. And I would say that's where the uncomfortableness maybe stems from.
There's a stat that I just heard on this one show, and it's we're all 99.5% the same, that we all come from, that we're related, that we could be 50th cousins. And I can't remember where I heard this, but it was so interesting. We're just really not that different.
Right. We're all human.
Yes.
We're all human.
Human race. There is no other race.
Yeah. And it's so powerful. Just that thought is so powerful, that we're human.
Rebecca, Clint, thank you both for being here. Really appreciate your openness and your honesty. And glad to have you.
Yeah. Thank you, Libby. It was really awesome being here.
It's an honor to be here. Thanks.
And that's it for this week's show. Thank you for joining us. Share the Mic was recorded at E3 Studios in Homewood, Alabama. Videography and editing by Ronnie Gatry and assisted by Sean Jensen. This show, Share the Mic, was produced by me, Libby Lassiter, and directed by my sister Sherry, with a lot of help from our Black and white friends.